There was an article in this week's edition of our church bulletin, The Weekly Visitor. It is titled, "Is It Nothing to You?" Perhaps many of you read it. Maybe some did not. But this article tells the story of a man named John Griffith, who was the controller of a great railroad bridge spanning the Mississippi River at St. Louis, Missouri. He and his family had moved to St. Louis, and in 1937, when there was a great dust problem in the Midwest, one day he took his son Greg, an 8-year-old boy, to work with him, the first time that he'd ever been with his dad to work. And he was showing him around and telling him of things that had to do with the railroad and the job. And they were eating lunch together on the observation deck. He had opened the bridge a little earlier to allow some boats to go through, and he had forgotten to close it. And then in the distance he heard the shrieking of a train whistle. It was the express to Memphis. There were 400 people on board. He hurried to the controls to close the bridge, to lower it so that that train could cross safely. When he put his hand on the lever, he looked down to see if there were any boats beneath, and to his horror he saw that his 8-year-old son had fallen from the observation deck and was lying among the gears of that great bridge, and his left leg was caught in one of the cogs. The train was approaching. What should he do? He knew what he must do. With a heart that was breaking, he pushed the lever, which crushed his son, but lowered the bridge so that the train could cross safely. And as that train roared across the bridge, with the anguish that was in the heart of a father, with tears streaming down his cheeks, he looked in those windows and saw, as the train passed by, businessmen that were reading the afternoon paper, women that were sitting in the dining car sipping coffee on their way home, conductors looking at their watches. And he cried out as they went by, "I sacrificed my son for you. Don't you care? Don't you care?" But nobody heard, and the train rushed on. In a few minutes, I want to share with you another page from real life, a lesson that we had a few years ago that I believe would be appropriate here, of another son, of another father. And again, it seems that few people really care. Crucify him. Crucify him. No words were more dreaded by the criminals of Jesus' day than were these words. No death is so thorough. No shame is so complete. First, there was the scourging. The scourging post was 2 feet high. It had an iron ring placed close to the top, projected from the 2 sides. The clothing was ripped away from the prisoner so that he stood naked, which was an added indignity. Roman lictors were professionals. They confined their labors to the fine, brutal art of scourging. And they could beat a victim until only the barest spark of life remained. The wrists were firmly shackled to the iron rings, and then the victim was stretched face down with his feet pointing away from the post. The Bible says, "Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him." John 19:1. The Roman scourge was a flagra, a short-handled whip consisting of several thin iron chains which ended in small weights. Scourging was called the little death. For you see, it preceded the big death, crucifixion. Even the tension of awaiting the first blow is cruel. The body is rigid, the muscles knot in tormenting cramps. Color drains from the cheeks. Lips are drawn tight against the teeth. Waiting, waiting. As the whip descends, the chains span out across the back, and each link cuts through the skin and deep into the flesh. The weights crash with bruising force into the ribs and curl bitingly around the chest. When a man is scourged, there is pain, pain beyond the memory of pain. Sweat bursts from the brow and stings the eyes. At each stroke of the whip, the body twitches with the force of the impact. The second stroke patterns the back and half of the chest with a V-shaped network of small cuts. Only the Son of God could hold back the high-pitched wail of unbearable agony. The very source of life is torn away with every lash. There is only the blinding, burning pain as cruel whips whistle again and again and again through the air and across the back and shoulders. Under Hebrew law, the strokes were limited to 39. Roman punishment was not so limited. There was only one rule for the lictor as he scourged a man about to be crucified. He must not die. A spark of life must be sustained for the agony of the cross. Men have been known to bite their tongues in two under beatings such as this. And only blessed unconsciousness could bring relief. The limp body of a victim was cut away from the post. His wounds were washed but not otherwise medicated. The next step was the parade to the place of execution. Roman politicians always liked to make examples of condemned men. The long, slow parade along public streets was designed to serve as a warning to others that Rome dealt quickly and mercilessly. And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called in the Hebrew Golgotha. John 19:17. A centurion usually served as the official executioner. While 4 soldiers held the prisoner, he placed the sharp 5-inch iron spike in the dead center of the palm of the victim's hand. A skillful, experienced blow would send it through to the wood. 4 to 5 more strokes would hammer the spike into the rough plank, and a final blow turned it up so the hand would not slip free. Then a nail is driven through each foot. The body is now secure. The beginning of a death reserved for slaves, thieves, and traitors has now begun. But he was none of these. The wounds in the hands set fire down through the arms, and fainting only relieves temporarily. It is darkness and pain, and then pain and darkness. The pain in the back, arms, feet, and body is a dull, throbbing, horrible, endless pain. The pain builds. It multiplies. It is cumulative. There is not a moment of respite. And the cross is planted so that the greatest amount of sunlight will pierce the sufferer's eyes. Even when the lids are closed, a red glare penetrates. Below, the curious watch and wait, fascinated by the torture. Like vultures, they're eager for blood, and the gruesome scene is played out slowly. Dying should be a private matter, not a public spectacle. There is something obscene about having a mob of people standing around waiting for you to die. Then the thirst begins. The lips are dry, the mouth is parched, the blood is hot, the pulse races, the skin is fevered. The greatest of all needs at the moment is a drop of cool water. After this, Jesus said, I thirst. But water is denied. At the foot of the cross, the death squad drinks in the presence of the dying man to add to his mental anguish and torment. The tongue thickens. What once was saliva is now like unloomed wool. Then swelling begins in the hands and feet. It's impossible to turn, to change one's position. Muscles begin to twitch. He humbled himself and became obedient even to the death of the cross. Philippians 2:8. The psalmist, looking ahead in time, saw this and prophesied concerning this moment of anguish and torment, and said in Psalm 22, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They look at me and stare. They part my garments among them and cast lots for my vesture. Now the real horror is only beginning. One by one, the muscles of the back gather in tight, knotty cramps. There is no escaping them, no pulling out of them, no gentle hands to ease and massage them away. They move across the shoulders and the thorax, that area of the body between the neck and the abdomen. After 2 hours on the cross, every muscle in the body is locked in solid knots, and the agony is beyond endurance. Men have been known to shriek themselves into insanity. The pain, the symptoms are identical to lockjaw or a state of a muscle when undergoing continued contraction. And man, with all of his genius, has never devised a crueler nor more agonizing death than this. The slow, steady, methodical advance of this into every fiber of the body is in this respect like crucifixion. Pain intensifying with each endless moment, and death the only hope of release. But death does not come. Each hour is an eternity. At times the cramps make the neck rigid and the head is held flush with the vertical beam of the cross. A man longs for death, but it does not come. And then there are flies. The yelps of dogs with the smell of blood in their nostrils, birds of prey, scavengers of the skies, circle lower and lower. As the hours pass, the tiny blood vessels which feed the nerves will be squeezed flat. And with a lack of circulation comes a numbing paralysis. But now a new agony develops for those who linger on the cross. It is the agony of the mucous membrane. On the cross, there is no end of suffering. It is only the manner of suffering that changes, and the degrees that changes. The mucous membrane, that thin tissue which lines and lubricates much of the human body, dries on the cross to the consistency of fine gravel. and scrapes the tender tissues from the nostrils throughout its passage of the body. And then as time drags on, soldiers were inclined to hasten death. They began breaking bones. Standing on a ladder, a practiced legionnaire would swing a mallet in the short arc and shatter the right femur of the thigh bone instantly. A second sharp blow would shatter the left leg. The crucified one could only look on in numbed horror as this merciless act took place. But fortunately, Christ was not required to endure this barbaric practice. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was dead already, they broke not his legs. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled. A bone of him shall not be broken. Could there ever be more intense suffering this side of hell? Is it possible for the human body to be subjected to greater agony and grosser indignities than these? He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. Isaiah 53, verse 5. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that by the grace of God he should taste death for every man. Hebrews 2, 9. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said this, he gave up the ghost. Luke 23, verse 46. God's Son was now dead. He died the most horrible and thorough death ever devised by man. It was the erosion of cell, of muscle, of tissue, mind, and spirit. During those 6 horrible hours that he suffered on the cross, his Father watched and suffered with him because souls were on their way to destruction. And his Father is crying out even now in so many ways, similar thoughts as John Griffith did that day in 1937. I sacrifice my son for you. Don't you care? Don't you care? And for most people, they do not care. And for many people, they do not know. You see, God reached down and provided a bridge to the other side, a bridge to safety, a bridge to salvation. And that bridge is his Son. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. He calls to every man, woman, and child to come to him. The question is, do you care? He did it for you. If there are those here this morning who need to cross that bridge, which is Christ, by obeying the gospel, we hope you care, and we hope you'll come as together we stand and sing.
I hear thy welcome voice.